Let's talk about security in Latin America. How can we protect people? How can people feel that their states and their communities are protecting them? Right now, there is a pandemic of short-termism. It's populism, I suppose. We have a president here in the United States who thinks that simply by bombing some boats, bombing some net laboratories, perhaps on land, they can solve the narco trafficking problem and perhaps even eject some dictators that they don't like from the region. In El Salvador, there's an enormously popular president who has locked up 3% of the male population, most of them without trial, and watched crime rates plummet. And there are leaders all over the region that are saying that they would like to emulate that. Now, this is not the right way to go. I mean, there has to be a way to make people feel more protected in the short term without waiting for some mythical moment in the future when institutions are working far better than they are now, and without violating human rights, without undoing democracy in the short term. Now, every country in the region does need their institutions to work far better than they do now, but that takes time. What about now? How can you answer the question of somebody who is paying extortion to gangs? Somebody's worried that their kid is going to be recruited, and they say, how can you make me feel safer in 6 months? How can you give them a plan? How can you give them a response without violating human rights and without undoing checks and balances? What are the choices for short-term security when you're working with the institutions that you currently have? And why are you screwing up if you treat organized crime like it's just some sort of rebel insurgency or terrorist group? Hi, I'm Adam Isaacson. I work on security at the Washington office on Latin America. It's a human rights group. It's been around for more than 50 years. What you're watching right now is not technically a WOLA product. It's more of a rough draft. I'm using these videos that I've been doing in late 2025 to sort of improve my own game, but also to help me think through our future work. We're in our end of year planning process here. Thoughtful comments are super welcome at this point. What I say here is not necessarily WOLA's consensus view. We're still developing these views all the time, especially when it comes to proposals. And this is certainly not the way WOLA would express everything. For instance, I don't think WOLA would use phrases like, you're screwing up. I would. I would like WOLA to continue to increase its communications capacity so that we can put out more videos and more other formats under our logo and chew all of our audiences. For that, though, we do need resources. We're a small organization and we need to keep growing to meet this moment. So if you find any of this useful, it's important that you go to wola.org and click on that donate button. It's right there in the upper right-hand corner. It's easy to do. It takes a minute. And all amounts are vital right now. Thank you. So let's dive in. Yes, it's slideshow time. So, all right, Nayib Bukele, the Bukele model, El Modelo Bukele, you hear about it all over Latin America. He's very popular. Despite, very strong human rights complaints, a lot of harm done to relatives of those who are locked up in his prisons, really the decimation of much of the free press and civil society, the end of checks and balances in what had been El Salvador's experiment with democracy. Bukele's popular. His approval ratings are usually north of 70% inside El Salvador, and he's often viewed as one of the most popular Latin American leaders around the region too. And the reason is, as we will see, he has brought down violent crime levels in what was one of the most violent, if not some years, the most violent country in Latin America and indeed the world. But he did it pretty indiscriminately. It's a policy of mass incarceration, of declaring states of emergency to curb rights and involve the military in day-to-day security. And so it looks like it's working now, but we're going to talk about for how long and whether there are better ways to go about this Bukele model. And it's a big deal right now because we're going to 2026, which is a big year for elections in Latin America. And it is not hard to hear candidates saying, I want to do what Bukele did in our country, which usually involves construction of prisons and giving free rein to the security forces. But let's back up for a minute. I mean, Latin America is unusual. It is particular. I mean, you have about 8% of the world's population, but you do have, this is from 2021, from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, you do have that 8% of the world's population accounts for about 1/3 of the world's homicides. And I'll be citing homicides quite a bit in the next little while because that's what the best record keeping usually covers. But you can assume that a lot of this also goes for other forms of at least violent crime. But you can see the reddish pink here, that leftmost 1/3 of that box are homicides in the Americas. And you can see there are more homicides in Mexico and Brazil than in the United States, although both countries have significantly less people than the United States. Homicide is an epidemic problem in the region. And remember, it's a region that doesn't even have armed conflicts for the most part. Yeah, I mean, there are some small armed conflicts, but most of the time, if you are looking at these countries, a country like Brazil, a country like Mexico, they are technically at peace. They don't have internationally recognized armed conflicts. Still, your chance of being violently killed there is greater than almost anywhere else in the world. That's homicide rates. If you look at the number of people killed per 100,000 inhabitants in these countries, the Americas has the highest rate, about 15 homicides per 100,000 people, according to UNODC, with some countries being significantly higher. You can see that just comparing the Americas to Europe, it looks like you're talking about two different planets in terms of levels of violence. Why? What's particular about Latin America? Are they just that much more prone to violence? I would say there's nothing in the Latin American character that explains that. There are many parts of Latin America that, in fact, have homicide rates similar to Europe's. But there are many parts of Latin America that are worse than some of the worst conflict zones in the world. A key reason or a key factor here is impunity, which is sort of an NGO jargon term, but it does mean the likelihood that you will actually ever be punished for committing a crime, including a violent crime as heinous as homicide. Here you can see that in Latin America, impunity is far more likely to be the outcome even after homicide. These are also charts from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Periodically, they do world reports on homicides. And you can see that they find a homicide rate here of a sample of 25 countries of 17.9 homicides per 100,000. The number of people convicted for homicide for all these cases is only 3.4 for 100,000, which means 3.4 out of 17.9. That's only about a fifth of homicide cases ever end up with a court actually determining who's guilty and meting out a punishment for that. You can see that on the right, where this is a smaller number of countries sampled, 5 in the Americas, but in those 5 countries, only 20% of homicides ended up with convictions. The homicide conviction rate is on that line, that blue line, about 20% compared to about 80% in 21 countries in Europe. That really does mean that 80% of killers in Latin America are just walking today amongst their victims and among normal citizens, having never been either identified or arrested or much less brought to trial and convicted. So that's a 80%-ish likelihood of getting away with murder. And of course, that creates its own incentives, and I think is an enormous explanatory value for why homicide is so much more frequent in the Americas. Now, I'm going to back up even a little more. When we're talking about impunity, one huge issue in the Americas, and therefore in the world, is the rate of deforestation in places like the Amazon. At a really remarkable and alarming rate, forests are being cut down, often just for timber harvesting or to create land for cattle ranching or other speculation. As a result, you're taking away some of the carbon sequestration capacity that the world needs in order to have any hope of controlling the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and to arrest climate change. Deforestation is happening at alarming rates, and it's happening despite the fact that the laws against deforestation are already pretty decent in the Americas. It's not like the Congresses in the region haven't written laws saying you're not allowed to just go in some area where the land isn't yours and bring down all the forests. That is already illegal, but it doesn't get enforced. Or maybe it gets enforced, but very often, and there are exceptions, some governments do it better than others and some presidents do it better than others, but quite often when there are arrests, there are operations to try to limit deforestation, the people who are arrested are small landholding campesinos, people who may have cut down a hectare or two of land to sort of colonize in an area, very small scale, and not accounting for that really large scale deforestation. You have a picture here from Colombia at the beginning of the 2020s. Colombia carried out a military operation called Operación Artemisa at sort of the northern fringe of the Amazon basin. They ended up arresting a lot of these campesinos, families who had moved into what were often national parks or other places where they shouldn't have been, cut down a little bit of forest, planted crops, maybe even brought in some cattle. Not great, not legal, but they were able to rack up large numbers of arrests to give the impression that they were really doing something about deforestation. However, the larger, clear-cutting, industrial scale turning of jungle into cattle ranches was not done by little campesinos. It was done by criminal groups or the nexus of criminal groups working in tandem with people who were otherwise, large quotation marks here, respectable. People who may have had political power. Some press coverage pointed to the governor of a department that has a lot of that forest in it, or, people with ties to industry, people tied to government, people who are considered large landowners, expanding their holdings or simply profiting from what was happening in the areas where deforestation was happening. A lot of this also in South Central Colombia had to do with the exit of the FARC guerrillas and the FARC dissident groups, sort of rearmed remnants of the FARC, deciding that they wanted to profit from deforestation. But again, doing it often in tandem with people in more respectable positions of power, what in Colombia or elsewhere they'll call la legalidad, people who have one foot in legality even as they go after this stuff. And those guys are so much harder to go after than, dirt poor campesino family. It's a very common phenomenon that we've seen. And it goes back to, before, but really well illustrated in season 1 of The Wire. If you've never watched The Wire, don't watch this, go watch The Wire. In season 1, one police unit is really following money and building cases and doing serious detective work to determine the real workings of a drug trafficking gang organization operating in Baltimore. And as they follow the money, of course, the money trail often leads to people who are in power. Now, that investigation is moving very slowly. Meanwhile, the police leadership and prosecutors and others are under a lot of pressure to show some results, get some dope on the damn table, as they had said in The Wire. And ultimately, the pressure to show results leads to a raid that does yield a lot of cocaine, pictured in this picture here. The larger investigation kind of just falls apart because of the raid, and the people who may have been at the end of those money trails get off scot-free because the whole operation ended with the raid. So again, the small fish, the pressure to show results, and not enough energy to go after the larger nexus of where organized crime and power cooperate, collude, and carry out crimes like deforestation or open pit precious metals mining that operate way out in the open. It's not like swallowing a few condoms of heroin and boarding a plane. It's way out in the open and easy to detect, but nothing happens because of the power structures behind it. And that's where you see a lot of mistakes made in the U.S. and generally region-wide approach to organized crime. Organized crime, when I say organized crime here, I mean what are often called cartels. I may be referring to some guerrilla movements. I may be referring to gangs, groups that do not have a political program, groups that are not trying to ever want to take power or formally govern in the areas that they control, that when they make money, they keep the money. Whereas an insurgency or a traditional, politically or religiously sectarian kind of terrorist group, when they make money, they often buy more guns with it. They're feeding their army with it, if that's the case. So if it's a money-making operation as opposed to an insurgency or a terrorist group, you would think that you would fight groups like that differently. But the trend lately is not. It's to look at an organized crime group like the Sinaloa cartel or the Tren de Aragua in Venezuela or MS-13, which is a much poorer group than the Sinaloa cartel because it doesn't traffic as many drugs, or the groups in Ecuador, and say, these guys are terrorists, or they're narco-terrorists, we're going to add them to the State Department's terrorist list. And the feeling is that we can just fight these organized crime groups the way that you fight a guerrilla insurgency. And that is just not true. It doesn't really work that way. I can name many areas in Colombia, a country that I've worked in a lot, where those areas were under the strong influence of the FARC guerrillas maybe, 15, 20 years ago. Even the mountains around Bogota, and 25 years ago, you couldn't even really drive in the countryside around Bogota for fear of being kidnapped by the guerrillas. Those areas are fully under state control now. I can think of very few areas in the region that, maybe over the last 20, 30 years were under the control of organized crime that are not under the control of organized crime still today. Neighborhoods in Medellin where everybody had to pay extortion to the groups affiliated or tolerated by the Medellin cartel, everybody still pays extortion now all over Medellin. Places that were key cocaine trafficking routes for organized crime in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, they're still heavily controlled by narco traffickers and remain key cocaine trafficking routes. Organized crime is so much more persistent than an insurgency. And if you fight it like an insurgency, all you will get is some dope on the table, some destroyed labs, and some arrested organized crime leaders. When these areas are under the control of organized crime, still today, the groups may be different. The names of the major capos may be different, but the phenomenon looks very similar, although it may even be a bit more violent in areas where there is anything like a dispute going on. Organized crime is just harder to fight than insurgencies. Just to explain the graphics on this slide, on the left here, the Washington Post did a report in 2013 showing how the FARC, which had most of its troops or most of its fighters separate from the population, living under triple canopy jungle in remote encampments, did not have much of a relationship with corrupt members of the government at all, and didn't really mix in with the population, turned out to be quite easy, relatively easy. It took years, but they were easier to defeat. With a bit of intelligence to find out where those encampments were, the Colombian military, with a lot of help from the CIA and elsewhere in the U.S. government, achieved air superiority and began killing guerrilla leaders in their encampments, to the point where at some point the FARC were in fact willing to negotiate a peace deal that was relatively beneficial to the state. The state didn't have to give up too much to the FARC to reach peace and demobilize that group. And on the right here you have, he was later arrested, but this is one of Chapo Guzman's sons who Mexico's forces tried to arrest in the middle of Culiacan, the capital of Sinaloa state, a few years ago. And when they did that, he's here surrendering himself, but the order went out, and armed thugs with huge weapons and armored trucks just pretty much stopped all daily business in Sinaloa for the entire day, setting up roadblocks, firing their weapons, creating chaos out of the city until the local forces stood down and let Mr. Guzman go. And he was free for a couple more years after what was called the Culiacanazo. Right in the middle of a city of about 1 million people, they were quite easily able to flex their control in a way that the FARC never would have dreamed of. A much harder enemy to combat. And of course, Joaquin Guzman, El Chapo Guzman, other Sinaloa cartel figures are now gone. They're in the United States. Sinaloa remains a major production and transit state for narco trafficking. The violence levels have gone up significantly. It's been something of a war zone in parts of Sinaloa for the past year and a half or so. It really does show that this is far harder than that CIA plan in Colombia to weaken the FARC just by bombing places in the jungle. Why is organized crime so much harder to fight? It's harder to fight because it doesn't want to fight the government. It prefers not to. It would much rather bribe and intimidate and buy off not just officials, but sometimes entire local police forces or local military forces, local judges, governors, mayors, local landowners, local chambers of commerce in the areas where they want to do business. And they certainly have the resources to do it due to the large markup that drugs and gold prices at record levels, migrants and human smuggling, human trafficking, that's a lot of money that they can spread around. And the message is simply, it's a cliche, but plata o plomo, silver or lead. You take my bribe or I'll give you the lead, the bullets, and kill you. In many parts of Latin America, Mexico, elsewhere, the corruption goes very high. In many parts of Latin America, even if there's not corruption necessarily, security forces and prosecutors and investigators have a strong disincentive to actually pursuing organized crime because it's very bad for your health. So, you've got all these examples in this slide of top level officials, including one Orlando Hernandez, who Donald Trump just mysteriously pardoned in the past few weeks, accusations of collusion with narco traffickers. The White House, even when they first started threatening tariffs against Mexico at the beginning of 2025, even talked about an intolerable alliance between drug trafficking organizations and the government of Mexico, which at many levels may be true. This is not the way I would have put it because it's not very constructive, but it is a real phenomenon. But the phenomenon goes all the way down to the military post on a river in Colombia that just turns its back when the boats full of cocaine come down the river to go take the product out of the country. or the many checkpoints in Mexico through which busloads of migrants taken by coyotes have always mysteriously been waved through at the right times, or the complete inability to respond to hundreds of hectares of forest being illegally cut down, often in indigenous preserves or national parks, or these disgusting open pit mines with power equipment in the middle of the jungle, easy enough to spot from a plane or a helicopter, but nothing ever gets done. And quite often when you talk to people on the ground, people will say things like, paraphrasing, well, the mayor is involved with this project as well, or local military is taking a payoff in order not to touch this. Organized crime needs local and even sometimes national corruption in order to do what it does. It prefers not to fight. And if it has to fight, that's bad for business. But often it does in order to make a point about ensuring that the state leaves it alone. But it would much prefer to just have the state or have the government let it continue its illegal operations peacefully. And in many parts of Latin America where violence levels are low, but rivers of contraband flow through, that is exactly what happens. Corruption is ultimately and impunity for the corrupt is ultimately the oxygen that organized crime breathes in the region. Of course, this happens at the local level. Groups like, the Fundación Paz y Reconciliación in Colombia here. I think this is a 2018 example. They come up with a lot of people like local politicians who get elected who they credibly believe to have had ties or have received money from organized crime groups. And it happens, of course, with the security forces, where unfortunately you do often see military personnel either looking the other way, avoiding fights, or sometimes teaming up with one armed or criminal group against another in sort of an enemy of my enemy arrangement. But it is widespread and it is very hard to investigate and punish, to hold people accountable and reduce impunity. Folks at Insight Crime, a terrific organization based in DC and Medellin, have documented that often in the legal political system, these ties exist as well. They had a wonderful investigation in 2019 about the man in the middle of this image called Memo Fantasma, somebody who is a narco trafficker, who is sort of tied to the paramilitary groups in Colombia, these sort of pro-government or pro-landowner militias that formed in the 1980s through the 2000s. Memo Fantasma never wore a uniform, though. He wore a nice suit, owned a lot of property, had a place in Spain. He was briefly arrested in the year after this Insight Crime investigation came out in 2019, but ultimately he was let go despite his many ties to people in criminality, but also in the legal economic system. Now, that's a big deal, but organized crime can also thrive, and this kind of violence can also thrive in areas where people just don't really see their government very much. Colombia, again, a country I've worked in quite a bit, is one of those countries where they're, especially in rural areas, but also in marginal urban areas, people really say, we don't ever see anybody from our mayor's office or any of the social service agencies, except maybe before election time. But even then, we're out here on our own. The roads are terrible. There's no potable water. The electric network ends, and we just sort of have to make do with diesel generators, even if we are only about 150 or so miles away from Bogota as the crow flies. Not seeing your government, except maybe the occasional military patrol that passes through, is a real problem. And it just provides a perfect climate for growing coca, for having an illicit precious metals mine, for taking down forests, and all of these really out in the open kind of crimes that thrive on corruption, but also thrive on a state vacuum. Look at these pictures. The left is from Reuters. The right is from the New York Times. There are these towns in Colombia where nobody ever bothered to build a road to these towns out in rural areas. They're usually on the side of a river, so you get there by boat. And you go to these towns, and we are talking within a 200-mile radius of Bogota, where you come to a town and things are kind of booming. I mean, the main street is made out of dirt, but there's discotheques, they're blaring music out of the bars in the morning. You can buy a pair of high-heeled shoes, etc. But then you go to a store and people will say, oh, I can't make change. I'm sorry, we don't have pesos. They don't have pesos. They're so unplugged or off the grid of governance that they can't even really get enough of their hands on currency. So instead of a cash register in some stores, as in these pictures here, you will see a scale. And people weigh out some crumbs of coca paste. That's what you're seeing there. When you turn the coca leaf and it's on its way to being cocaine, The most crude initial step that the farmers themselves can do is to soak it in some chemicals and it turns into this really nasty paste. You weigh out on the left here, it's 7 grams of coca paste gets you that much groceries. That much coca paste gets you a fish or a bag of rice. And you can just actually transact with coca paste instead of currency because that's how off the grid of governance you are. Of course, organized crime thrives on that. And of course, simply arresting a capo or bombing drug lab is not really ever going to change that dynamic. And there's so much area. This is just in South America. You can draw this in other parts of Latin America also, where these sort of conditions prevail. This is not an ArcGIS scientifically made map. This is me sitting with my iPad one day just trying to draw a circle around areas that could be considered that poorly governed, or that absently governed, I should say. And yeah, these are just areas that could almost have their own separate seat of the United Nations at this point, because states really don't exert much sovereignty in the Arco Minero of Venezuela, in the upper northwest of Brazil's Amazon, most of south central Colombia, the Catatumbo region, Colombia's Pacific coast, Ecuador's border zones, Peru's Amazon. And you often see a lot of the same armed groups in these areas also. The ELN are all over Venezuela. You've got Brazil's groups participating in the coca and cocaine trade in south central Colombia, Brazil being the world's #2 cocaine consuming country. You've got Mexican buyers very actively controlling how supply chains run in Colombia, in Ecuador. My point here is you've got this vast ungoverned area where it is quite easy for organized crime groups, but also insurgencies who really are getting harder and harder to distinguish from. The line between political group and money-making operation has blurred quite a bit, but those categories are all over these ungoverned areas. And you see ups and downs. Sometimes you will see violent crime rates plummet even as state control doesn't really increase or impunity doesn't change very much. That often means there's some sort of arrangement where one group has gained a sort of monopoly, a Pax Mafiosa, if you will, over a specific area. And there's no more violent competition. And the state is maybe letting things go for a while. In Medellin, you certainly saw that in the mid-2000s when one paramilitary faction took over criminality in the city. And then you saw the violence levels increase near the end of the decade after the leaders of that paramilitary faction got extradited to the United States. However, you can see there that it didn't rise in Medellin to the horrific levels that Medellin was suffering. Look at the homicide rate of 174 in 2002. It didn't rise back to that level. And part of that is because local governments, and to some extent national governments in Colombia, did a better job of improving state presence in the city of Medellin. There have been ups and downs, but generally the trend has been downward if you graph it over 20 years, because there actually has been a more concerted effort to bring not just police, but green space and social services and better schools and school programs and jobs programs and things like that, and transportation all over what had been the very marginal cutoff slums on the fringes of Medellin. Sometimes these Pax Mafioso sort of arrangements can buy time for the state to improve its presence in these areas. It's still very debatable, though, whether Medellin or Colombia at large has made much of an improvement on impunity for collusion with these groups, but there have been some key cases, especially, for instance, the parapolitics case, where a lot of politicians were punished for colluding with the right-wing paramilitaries. When you are only hitting armed groups with military force, but not doing much on the state presence and impunity fronts, you end up seeing a real fragmentation of groups. Quite often you will take out one big group, and either that group splits and has internecine battles for succession, or another group, a criminal group from outside, comes from without and starts to compete in the area where there had been a monopoly. You can see this slide from the Mexico Violence Research Project just showing over a course of just over 10 years how this list in the upper right of criminal groups in Mexico keeps growing and growing, as starting with the Calderon government, the U.S.-backed offensive against organized crime groups does weaken a lot of the groups, but then causes a lot more competition. And you do see violence spike whenever you see that many groups competing for control of a region. So what do we do? This is a really tough phenomenon. I mean, the state absence, the impunity, the treating organized crime like it's just one more insurgency or terrorist group, that's not working. But what do you do? I mean, We in places like WOLA and throughout the human rights community, throughout the legal community, much of the academic community, there's not much disagreement on what the long-term fix looks like. You build up institutions, you build up the ability to carry out investigations, intelligence. You have a lot of counterintelligence and a lot of internal investigations to root out corruption and train people and protect people to fight impunity. And you do this within a framework of democracy and respecting and improving observance of human rights as you do it. That all sounds amazing, right? You're building up finally functioning security sectors that can permanently, for generations, make people feel safer, the way that people feel safer in Northern Europe and in much of the United States, for instance, these days. But boy, that takes a long time. You can't just do that in a few months. You can't suddenly say, oh, fix your justice system. These are slow approaches. They are ultimately what is needed. I mean, there's ultimately no substitute for having a functioning security sector and all of these institutional strengthenings. However, the long term is when we are all dead, and there is no shortage of leaders in the region promising short-term fixes, an easy crash diet way to solve these problems. Let me just talk briefly about these longer-term solutions, and I'll try not to get too bogged down in it, but just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. I already talked about state presence. This map of Colombia from 2012 on the left just shows all of those orange municipalities don't even have a prosecutor. Like if you have a dispute with somebody or if you are the victim of a crime, you got to go to another municipality to have the prosecutor's office, which in Colombia is in charge of most investigations, look into it for you. It'll take years, right? So it's often easier just to go to your local armed or criminal group to settle disputes or to enforce basic law. Some of these municipalities are the size of northeastern U.S. states, too. It's vast areas that don't even have prosecutors or investigators working under them. And on the right is civilian police. The police are largely an urban phenomenon, and most rural areas, security is left up to the military. The exception to that should be carabineros in the police force, but they barely cover. They don't cover very many municipalities either. It's left up to the military. Judicial reform. I mean, whether you're a victim of a crime, whether you're a victim of a human rights abuse, whether you're a victim of corruption, whether you are an investor who got ripped off, whether you're trying to actually bring reparations to victims and reveal the truth of what happened in an armed conflict, all roads go through the justice system. For drug crimes, anything, you need to have a justice system that is able to, as quickly as due process allows, hold people accountable for committing crimes. You just don't have that in Latin America. I took this picture of, this is the entire Palace of Justice for the Department of Guaviare in South Central Colombia back in 2007, under-resourced, to say the least, and often subject to the same dynamics of corruption and plata o plomo as other parts of the government. Good police work is also crucial here. Good police work is a very general term, and I don't have time to talk about all of the tenets of police reform here. I include this gang hotline task force model that police in Northern Virginia followed, though, because I think it's a neat example. In the mid-2000s, there was a bit of a scare in Northern Virginia, which has a large Central American population. There was a bit of a scare about possible MS-13 and other gang activity among the Central American young people community there. Rather than just throw everybody in jail, rather than terrorize the community and round people up and, chase them all over the place, what the police did in the Northern Virginia suburbs of Washington was talk to people. Say, you can come to us and you'll be safe if you give us information. We're not looking to arrest everybody. We are looking for the small percentage, single-digit percentage of people involved in this activity who really are the generators of violence. And we want to get them, the nodes on the network, and put them away. And to this day, one of the biggest Central American communities in the United States has hardly any MS-13 affiliated or Barrio 18 affiliated gang problem. I mean, they did good intelligence and good relations with the communities, building trust so that people would share information about who the biggest problem causers were. Obviously, police professionalization. If you have a police department nationally in these countries often that does not have a strong academy that offers a real professional degree, where you don't get a salary that is high enough that it has to be supplemented by bribes, if it's not really clear what gets you a promotion and what gets you rewarded, the default would be, if you're not clear about that, it's probably just having some relationship with the chief or something having to do with corruption. You need police to be seen as a profession. In too much of Latin America, it's been viewed as a low status job, and that has to change so that civilians can really take over security. So much of this, especially when you're talking about organized crime and following money flows and being able to just be asking dangerous questions to figure out what's happening, is investigative work, detective work. That often in the region falls to prosecutors' offices and to specialized police units and sometimes to intelligence units. And all of them tend to be very weak and very prone to threats or to corruption. Again, building cases, trafficking financial flows, follow that money. You don't know where it's going to lead. And when these investigations do happen, they reveal remarkable things in the region, from the La Linea scandal in Guatemala to the Odebrecht and car wash scandals in Brazil. Although right there I'm mentioning scandals that didn't quite involve organized crime as much as common graft. When it involves organized crime, it is far more dangerous to do, but it also reveals a lot more about how power and money are working in your country. Prisons are horribly overcrowded. People often end up going to prison for a crime, waiting a long time even to go before a judge after they're in that prison, and coming out of the prison having been recruited into organized crime by their fellow inmates. The phrase universities of crime often gets applied to prisons, and some of the most powerful organized crime groups in the region, Tren de Aragua, PCC in Brazil, the Leones and Choneros in Ecuador, have really built themselves up, or they were founded and grew in the country's prison systems. Even when you have a situation where there's 3,000 inmates and only about 50 guards, who's really running the prison? And who's really watching for the kind of corruption that allows people to both control and manage themselves in these prisons? Part of professionalization and part of gaining the trust of the population and being a properly functioning institution of democracy is to have clear human rights policies that do involve holding those accountable when they do violate human rights on purpose. And it's not just things having to do with the police, the prisons, the justice, and the military. It is things that civil society does as well, or that the civilian part of the state does as well. A lot of great initiatives can actually bring pretty quick results against crime, usually at the very local neighborhood level, when they address the needs of, say, young people who are afraid of being recruited and need something to do in some place that is going to take care of them, say between when school lets out and when the sun goes down. School activities, job training activities, something for that often north of 1/3 of the population between the ages of 15 and 30 that may not even be going to school or have a job, getting those people into something productive. But even things like nighttime lighting or improving hotspot policing, or in that picture on the right, actually helping remove tattoos. There's so many kinds of programs that fit under these kinds of initiatives that can be done without needing somebody in uniform to carry them out. And of course, as I mentioned from the very beginning, depriving organized crime of the oxygen that it gets from its collusive relationship with key people in the state, in the government, and making sure that those in the state who cooperate with organized crime are held accountable for it. So just to sum all that up, that whole long-term thing, when people often talk about how countries need a strong security sector, what does that mean? It's much more than just the people in uniform and the intelligence services, although they, of course, are an indispensable part of what it takes to protect people from violence in those countries. You can't really do this without the other branches of government that are actually, once somebody is arrested, what happens to them? How do you learn about their criminal structures from them? How do you hold them accountable? How do you do it in a way that doesn't make the punishment into a way that makes them into even more hardened criminals? That's where other branches of government, like prosecutors, investigators, courts, and prisons, come in to play. The civilian parts, you need a civilian defense minister. You need people with technical expertise in how you carry out security policies, who are not just people in uniform, who have a broader view of what is needed. You need inspectors general and others who are doing oversight on the inside. And you also need people inside government, but not the same part of government, who are doing oversight on the outside. The whole checks and balances and oversight thing is super important here. Comptrollers, the Congresses of these countries, especially the committees that are supposed to be carrying out oversight and budgeting and looking out for corruption and looking to see what policies are working and what aren't and what needs to be fixed. Ombudsmen, so that citizens have some place to go if they are abused or if something is clearly not working. Internal affairs investigators. But a real security sector isn't just government. If an NGO is credible and bringing important information to the debate and doing a good job of evaluating what is working and what is not, and denouncing when things are not, or when the corruption has gone out of control. Independent media, people who are carrying out investigations and revealing things that all of those inner rings of government, even the oversight ones, often don't get to. Independent experts who understand security and are able to explain it to people. in the citizenry. These are all part of the security sector too. And all of these rings need to be strengthened. These are all legs of the table that if even one of them is weak, that table's not going to stand in the long term. So that's the long term. What about the short term? Who's offering short-term fixes? I already mentioned Nayib Bukele. He certainly has a set of solutions that has lowered violence measures rather quickly, particularly since 2021. And you've got also leaders like, say, Gustavo Petro with his Total Peace program in Colombia, or Lopez Obrador in Mexico with his Hugs Not Bullets program, who favored either formal or informal dialogues and arrangements with the armed groups to get them to improve their behavior, which sometimes also, not always, but sometimes brings reductions in violence measures too. And then, of course, you have people, I don't even have a slide for him yet, like the President of the United States, who believes that just bombing the hell out of small-scale narco-traffickers is going to somehow bring security as well. They're promising short-term fixes. They're often quite populist in their approach. So Nayib Bukele, at the beginning of his presidency, 2019 to 2021, he did bring help. There already was a downward trend in homicides, but he did bring them down even more. We later found out by negotiating a deal with MS-13 and other gang leaders in El Salvador's prisons. Secret negotiations did improve the gang's behavior somewhat, although they certainly still extorted like crazy. They still recruited like crazy. They were still disappearing people. But homicides did go down. That kind of fell apart in early 2022 with an orgy of violence. We still don't know why the gangs thought this would be a good way to try to pressure the Bukele government. But Bukele, at the end of March 2022, responded with a state of emergency and a crackdown. That state of emergency has continued to this day with constant sweeps and patrols of anybody who looked like a gang member or, in Bukele government's parlance, a terrorist, and massively arresting people, largely young men. If you're a young man with a tattoo, your chance of being arrested is very high. Long times awaiting trial, and many of those trials involving hundreds of people being judged or guilty all at once, ending up in prisons like the Secot, but many others where conditions are even more brutal. This slide shows 75,000 people detained since the state of emergency began, but it's an old slide. It is now somewhere in the 80,000s. The overall prison population in El Salvador is getting somewhere between 100 and 110,000 people, which, again, about 3% of the male population, maybe 4% or more of the male population between 18 and 35 years old. It is by far the highest incarceration rate in the world. And yeah, I mean, here's the homicide rate in El Salvador. You see where Bukele was inaugurated. You see the state of emergency. The United States homicide rate, last I looked, was hovering around 5 or 6 per 100,000 inhabitants. And El Salvador, at least according to official statistics, is lower than that. I mean, they are looking like almost like Scandinavia at this point, if you believe these statistics completely. And again, this may be missing things like disappearances. But this progress has come with a great human rights cost. I've already mentioned some of it. You've probably seen the brutal videos and or heard the testimonies of Venezuelan migrants who were freed from the Secot about the regular beatings and other assaults and even sexual assault that they suffered. The family members gathered outside the prison insisting that their children had nothing to do with the gangs. There's lamentations of a significant portion of the population that is just terrified of Bukele's security forces. But the majority of the population still is thankful to Bukele. Well, there you have it. Very high popularity rates. This graph is, I believe, from early 2024. Bukele may have gone down slightly since then. Very, very high approval ratings because, if you had a store that was being extorted by gangs, if you were worried that your daughter was going to be recruited or even raped by the gangs, if you couldn't go out at night. But now you're not paying extortion, so you basically got a big raise. You're not worried about your daughter. You are going out and walking in the park and even going out to dinner in your neighborhood where you weren't able to go out after 6 p.m. Of course, you're probably very thankful to Nayib Bukele and willing to pay the price of having soldiers everywhere, having to show your ID a lot, and having a significant portion of young men in your country being locked up, even if they were innocent. People may be willing to swallow hard and make that trade-off because they can't imagine that longer-term security sector model even working. It's so beyond their imagination. Ecuador, another country where the homicide rate went up something like 6 times in the course of 3 years, which it's hard to find another jurisdiction anywhere where that happened. A perfect storm of factors that converged as the pandemic happened and after to cause just a free-for-all between organized crime groups. It looks like 2025 is going to be higher than 2024. Again, the Ecuadorian government has not gotten a handle on their organized crime violence problem. But I would point out that, it's not like you can't just say, oh, it's because of cocaine. Ecuador always had lots of cocaine going through it. Their security forces always seized dozens and dozens of tons of cocaine, even in the years when it was peaceful. And when you had sort of more of a Pax Mafiosa and there were only a few, a single digit number of homicides per 100,000 people happening in Ecuador, it was considered one of the more anomalously peaceful countries in Latin America. There was still cocaine there. There were still illicit precious metals mining there, but there was not as much competition. Something changed within the structure of these groups and the rivalries between these groups to cause things to be much worse. It was fed by corrupt collusion. Prosecutors have, not enough in my view, but prosecutors have sought to investigate much organized crime-tied corruption in Ecuador that allowed a lot of this to thrive in the Correa government. But before, that was the leftist government that ruled for about 10 years. But before that and after it as well, it remains a severe problem. And they really haven't gotten a handle on it, even in the prison system, which the military took over. But the prisons still remain largely controlled by organized crime today. There's a lot of talk about, well, why doesn't Ecuador just pursue the Bukele model? And while he hasn't exactly used those words, President Noboa, a man of the right, has sought to crack down that way in Ecuador. But it's harder. I mean, first, Ecuador is a lot bigger than El Salvador. You find that right away when you're dealing with a lot of territory. But also, MS-13 would have loved to have moved cocaine from one continent to the other because that's huge money and much more profitable than the extortion and small-scale drug selling and neighborhood rackets that they had. The groups in Ecuador are moving cocaine across Ecuadorian territory from Colombia and out the ports, and that is much more profitable. These are much wealthier groups than the gangs that Bukele, at least for now, has subdued. So because they're wealthier and they have so much more plata o plomo capacity, they are a much more formidable enemy, and that may be in part why Noboa has not been able to get control of his prisons or bring the homicide rate down yet, even as he promises a hard line. I guess this is a slide basically showing the same thing, that the trend continues to be really discouraging in Ecuador for now. That's the crackdown route. And then there's the negotiate with the armed groups route, which can yield some results at some point in at least controlling violent crime rates and improving the behavior of organized crime. Sometimes you'll have situations where the government sort of is the quiet arbiter of who has control over a certain drug trafficking route, and they will only combat the groups if the groups break the rules and start making life difficult for civilians. But if cocaine is peacefully flowing through someplace and violent crime rates are low, you might suspect that there is some sort of quiet dialogue happening there where there's some power sharing happening to allow that route to continue peacefully and to keep competing groups out. But then there's also more formal negotiations that sometimes can improve behavior. And if that happens, and if you do have a lull in violence, it really is up to the government in a big way to bring in more presence and reduce impunity. But that rarely seems to happen when these short-term negotiated deals happen, and quite often their effects are short-lived. It's always hard to show a quadrant diagram to people in a talk, but this one's kind of important to me. If a government in a country wants to take on its organized crime and insecurity problems, it's going to need a short-term plan and it's going to need a long-term plan. Quite often, sadly, many countries in the region are in quadrant one, where they don't have either. There's no real clarity about what the short-term or the long-term plan is. Countries like El Salvador are in quadrant two, where it's pretty clear what Nayib Bukele's short-term plan is: keep the mass incarceration up, keep the state of emergency going, do your high-value targeting. Some other short-term plans are just to negotiate with organized crime. That can bring you short-term success. It's unlikely to last beyond a few years, and quite often the corners you had to cut, the deals you had to make, the recognition of illegality or the illegal behavior itself, like all of the torture and human rights violations, that carries its own cost as well. So quadrant two is not a great place to be, even though you might be very popular in the short term if you carry it out. Quadrant three is where you have a long-term plan. You know what your security sector reform effort or your peace process, perhaps, peace accord implementation is going to look like, but you don't have a short-term plan. What does that mean? It means that patience often runs out. You've got this beautiful vision of how your justice system and how your police reform and everything else are going to work, but that takes like 10 years. And in the meantime, people are still being killed and extorted, and patience runs out. Populist politicians are dangling much tougher sounding alternatives in front of the population. And, ultimately, people don't see the results quickly enough, and maybe you're out of office before that long-term plan can really get too far along. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the human rights community might suffer from this too. We are always like talking about what is needed in the long term, but we don't always have the best answer for how can you make me feel safer in 6 months. Quite often, if there's a lot of civil society participation accompanying the long-term plan, that can help, but it's certainly not a sufficient condition. And quadrant 4 is this magic area where I can't think of any governments that have really carried it out, but where you've got a long-term plan and a short-term plan to buy time for the long-term plan to happen. And that short-term plan is not violating human rights or playing footsie with armed or criminal groups. If you are playing footsie, that could complicate your ultimate transition to that more desired long-term outcome where you have a more functioning security sector. But yeah, quadrant 4 would be a great place to do it. But okay, smarties, all of you people who want a functioning security sector that respects human rights and democracy, but it takes forever for people to feel the effects. What would you do in the short term to buy time for that to happen without harming democracy, without negotiating with criminals? Well, there's a bunch of things you could do, and there's nothing that fits on a bumper sticker, right? There's a lot of interventions you can do in the short term that may have some hope, especially if you do them, as many of them at once as possible, some hope of bringing a palpable improvement to people's security while we await the more proper reforms to prisons and police and justice and all the rest. The youth violence prevention programs, like some of the ones I mentioned above in the community violence prevention program slide, firearms, alcohol sales, drug courts and cognitive behavior therapy programs, community justice houses, getting the mobile phones out of the prisons, more video cameras, domestic violence programs, making women feel safer when they're on the bus or on the metro. Hotspot policing programs have had very strong short-term effects where you actually figure out using data and using mapping where the people that are responsible for the majority of crimes are congregating and carrying out those crimes, and surging police to those areas in as real time as you can, as the data indicates. Reducing response times when people call for help so they start trusting the government to actually show up when you do make a 911 or similar call. Ceasefire programs where the police identify who are the most violent, the biggest troublemakers, or actually talk to the gangs and say, look, you're going to have a much easier time of it if you don't cause trouble with violence. Doesn't solve the problem of gang membership, but can definitely influence the behavior. Body cameras, community policing, and just interacting with neighborhoods. Just having the schools be more open and have a place for kids to be when school lets out. Job training for people who need to reintegrate into the legal economy. Conditional cash transfer programs can do certain things to improve access to social services. Green space, open space, public lighting, revitalization of parks, places where people can feel safe, but also that they're maintained. It's not broken windows or blight. Really, some studies show have some effect on security and can be fixed up rather quickly quite often. And of course, transparency. We all need data about what's happening where, what's working, where the police are, what's being spent, and what the latest crime statistics are, as broken down by geography as possible, so that there can be accountability, so that the whole community that wants to participate in this process can participate in it, so they can see what's working and what's not, and not just be governed by vibes about, I just don't feel safe, and actually be able to measure what's working and what's not. Access to data is just hugely important here, not just for nerdy specialists, but for people, so that they can actually review the data when they're in their church group or when they're in their PTA meeting or its equivalent. Know what's working, what's not, and ask the police and other local leaders when it's not, why isn't it working? Okay, so that's the vision of how you would build a short-term set of policies to buy time for the larger, more important long-term policies that in turn can help break those links between organized crime and the state, lower impunity, and therefore ultimately lower those homicide rates and other violent crime and security issues for good. This is the best I've come up with for how to buy time. These sorts of fragmentary programs brought together, which kind of have to be as national as possible. You have to do as many of them as possible. They cost money, but guess what? So do prisons and mano dura policies. This would be more effective in the long term. It would actually, I should say, this would be what would buy the time for the more effective long-term policies to really take root. Now, along the way, it's important not to get distracted if there is a short-term improvement and think that you've solved the problem and you can just sort of walk away now. One thing you've seen quite often is like, oh, look, Plan Colombia brought the price of cocaine up for a little while in that rectangle on the left. It got a little bit scarcer and therefore we made a lot of progress and the problem became sort of manageable. People weren't talking about cocaine and cocaine overdoses as much, even though cocaine remained, as you can see here, a little bit more expensive, but still reasonably easy to obtain, but it just wasn't as big of a problem. Or during the later Bush and during the Obama administrations, a number of migrants coming to the U.S.-Mexico border took a dive. There were still 30,000 people a month coming to the border, still indicating that there was something really wrong with our migration system and something really wrong with what was happening in Latin America that made people want to flee, but it felt so much more manageable than what came before. I mean, the same way here in the United States, we'll get comfortable with a certain number of deaths on our highways every year. And what happens quite often is when a problem seems manageable, the way policymaking happens, when people are appropriating money for things or people are looking at a whole menu of threats that they have to address, the one that looks manageable kind of gets walked away from and ignored before the fundamental long-term strategy is actually implemented and the fundamental causes are addressed. And what happens is it's a slow motion game of whack-a-mole, and ultimately that unaddressed problem, when it's walked away from, starts to reemerge. And we're seeing a lot more cocaine now in the United States. We've obviously seen migration go way up and way down in the United States as well, because we have not addressed fundamental problems with our drug policy, with our migration policies, or with the root causes why people take drugs, why people still feel compelled to migrate. And I'll just end on this, where there really is no manageability or short-term manageability choice at this point is the thing I was talking about at the beginning, deforestation and climate change. I don't think there's any way you can even reach a manageable level of deforestation or desertification or coral reef loss at this point. I think we're so late now that we really do have to address it in a more serious way and in a more long-term way and in a more concerted way. And the organized crime tide, security-related, impunity-related aspects of this are where we really have to be focused on. Otherwise, we are going to see changes to our climate that will no longer be manageable and have any hope of being manageable. So that is an argument against manageability and short-termism in a quite urgent way when it has to do with the phenomena leading to the environmental damage that cause climate change. I will leave that here. I've been talking for more than an hour, but that's sort of the vision here, that we need a way to buy time for proper human rights respecting and democratic long-term security sector building efforts to take root. And that way to buy time should not involve locking up a huge amount of your population, violating human rights, or having to negotiate with murderers. It should involve a lot of these smaller efforts that do have to be carried out as many as at once as possible on a national level and in a concerted way so that people do feel improvements while they await the longer term democratic security conditions to take root. So that's my message. As you can see, I'm still refining it. I really welcome comments on this, especially on that short-term conundrum. What else works? Experiments that have worked, experiments that have failed even, and just general thoughts on how we can crawl out of this at a time when, even as the hardline populist short-termist solutions are in the ascendant and appear to really have captured the imagination of a lot of people, those of us who know that this is not the way to go have to get better at talking about alternatives. So that's my effort here, and thank you for listening.